By 5:46 in the morning, the fairground still smelled like last night. Fried sugar, spilled beer, damp sawdust, diesel from generators that had only just gone quiet, burnt oil from rides cooling in the dark, trampled grass, wet canvas. The county fair always felt temporary in daylight and faintly unreal before sunrise, as if the whole thing had been assembled overnight by a species that didn't understand silence. Rows of booths stood shuttered and dim. Strings of bulbs hung dead and colorless along the midway. Prize games sat vacant under plastic tarps. Music, mercifully, was gone. What remained were steel frames, muddy paths, and the creaks and settling noises of machinery at rest. The Ferris wheel dominated everything. Even switched off, it rose above the fairground like a skeletal moon, all spokes and empty gondolas holding the first gray of dawn in their metal ribs. The loading platform sat deserted. The operator booth window reflected the midway lights from farther down. Mud had churned thick around the ride after yesterday's heavy crowds and the evening rain, especially behind the ticket rail and along the maintenance side where trucks had cut deep tire grooves into the ground. That was where the Bobcat was. Not out at the livestock pens where feed bins and hay invited scavengers. Not slipping past the food trailers. Not in the scrub at the fairground perimeter where a wild thing belonged. It sat directly beneath the Ferris wheel. Marlin Pike saw it first. At 59, Marlin had been operating rides for longer than some of the county deputies had been alive. He didn't own the wheel. Nobody on the circuit really owned anything the way people imagined. They leased, transported, repaired, and prayed over these machines in equal measure. But he was responsible for it. Bolts, gates, load balance, morning checklists, brake pressure, emergency stop, seat latches, control panel tests. He had the kind of mechanical suspicion that kept people alive around traveling steel. If something felt off, he trusted that feeling. So when he trudged through the back service lane with a thermos of coffee and a toolbox in hand and saw a Bobcat under the Ferris wheel platform, he stopped hard enough that the coffee sloshed over his fingers. "Well, that's not ideal," he muttered. The Bobcat looked at him, then toward the rear mud behind the loading gate. That was the first wrong thing. The second was that it didn't leave. Marlin had worked county fairs, harvest carnivals, and interstate festival lots from Arkansas to western Pennsylvania. He'd seen raccoons in game booths, foxes near the food dumpsters, deer wandering through livestock lanes after storms, and once in Missouri, a black bear in the employee parking area that made everybody very suddenly cooperative. But those animals did what sensible animals did. They moved off when people showed up. This Bobcat stayed. Young, he thought at once. Not fully grown, but not small. Lean, spotted, ears sharply tufted, pale, tawny fur gone gray in the weak dawn. It sat with its body turned not toward escape, but toward the muddy strip behind the Ferris wheel's rear support brace. Marlin set down his toolbox slowly. "Hey," he called, low and steady. "Go on." The Bobcat rose, patted 6 feet to the left, and stopped. Still there. Still looking at the same patch of ground. A line of unease moved through Marlin's chest. He knew the backside of that wheel, the maintenance access stairs, the support braces, the cable housings, the tarp-wrapped spare parts, the utility trench where the temporary power ran beneath plywood mats. Nobody should have been back there before opening except him, and certainly nothing should have been drawing a predator's full attention under the ride. He took 3 cautious steps. The Bobcat backed away the same amount, then turned and sat again near the brace. Not fleeing, not cornered. Just fixed. By then another worker, Tino from the Tilt-A-Whirl crew, had come around the beer garden fencing, carrying coiled extension cable over one shoulder. He followed Marlin's stare, then the Bobcat, then the wheel. "What is that doing here?" "That," Marlin said, "is what I'm trying to figure out." Tino took one look at the animal's posture and lowered the coil to the ground. "It's watching something." Marlin hated how quickly that sentence felt true. They moved together around the maintenance side of the ride, slow and wide so the Bobcat had room to bolt if it finally came to its senses. It didn't. It only gave ground in careful increments and kept them aligned with the same area of churned mud behind the rear's support. The rain had turned that section of the fairground into a thick brown mess. Boot tracks, Tire ruts, boot prints over tire ruts, spilled straw from the prize petting zoo, cigarette butts mashed into the slurry, and the deep crescent impressions where the ride stabilizers sat. It was the sort of ground that remembered everything for a few hours, and then nothing once enough people walked it flat. The Bobcat stopped beside one narrow trench of shadow under the wheel's rear platform. Marlin's eyes followed its line and caught on something pale in the mud. A shoe, child-sized, pink sole, half buried near the back rail. His whole body went cold. Tino saw it a second later and swore in Spanish. Now that it had been seen, other details assembled themselves too quickly. A drag of disturbed mud leading behind the electrical box, a handprint low on the rear metal step. One dropped ticket strip mashed into the churned ground. The kind of signs that looked random right up until they didn't. The Bobcat paced once, stopped, looked under the platform. Marlin dropped to a crouch beside the shoe. It was fresh, mud wet on the outer sole, Velcro strap torn loose. He turned it over with 2 fingers, and something underneath the muck flashed silver in the dawn. A little charm bracelet clasp, still attached around the heel loop. Not abandoned yesterday by chance. Not old lost and found fairground junk. Something bad had happened back here after dark. Marlin rose too fast and had to catch the support brace with one hand. "Call 911." Tino was already fumbling his phone out. The dispatcher got a tight, practical summary. County Fairgrounds, Ferris wheel rear maintenance side, child shoe in fresh mud, possible missing child, something wrong beneath the ride platform. Send deputies, send EMS, send somebody now. As Tino talked, Marlin moved closer to the underside of the ride. He knew exactly how much room there was under the Ferris wheel platform. Enough for wiring runs, access boxes, brake housings, and a crouch person if they were determined or scared enough to hide. The control booth side was open waist-high. The rear side dropped lower and darker where the mud sloped beneath the frame. The Bobcat stood just beyond the reach of his arm, staring under the platform so hard it made Marlin's own heartbeat feel louder. Then he heard it, a tiny metallic jingle from the darkness. Not machinery. Then a sound, not quite crying, more like someone trying not to cry and failing at it in breaths. Marlin's mouth went dry. "Hey!" he shouted toward the underside of the wheel. "Is somebody in there?" The answer came after one agonizing pause. A child's voice, weak and frightened and very real. "Don't let him come back." Every inch of the fairground changed in that instant. The Ferris wheel was no longer a ride. The mud was no longer just weather damage. The Bobcat was no longer merely strange. Marlin dropped to his knees in the mud and peered under the platform. At first he saw only cross braces in shadow, then a pale sleeve, a curled shape, a little face streaked with mud and tears. A girl no older than 7 was wedged behind the low hydraulic service housing, half hidden by tarp-wrapped spare parts and a coil of yellow safety rope. One bare foot tucked under her, one muddy sock on the other. Her left wrist held the broken end of a charm bracelet. Her eyes, huge and glassy with fear, stayed fixed not on Marlin, but on the open side of the midway beyond him, as if expecting someone else to appear. "Oh, God," Marlin said softly. "Hey, honey, you're okay. You're okay now." She shook her head once, tiny and violent. Tino ended the call and crouched beside him. "Can you reach her?" Marlin assessed the space in a second. The child wasn't pinned exactly, but the service housing and low beam made the angle bad. If she bolted deeper into the underside, she could wedge herself where they'd need tools to get her out. If he lunged, he might scare her into exactly that. "Not fast," he said. So they did the slow thing. Marlin set both hands where she could see them. Tino lowered his voice into the soft, practical tone adults used on skittish dogs and frightened children because both understood calm before language. They asked her name. She whispered, "Maddie." They asked if she was hurt. She pointed to one knee, one elbow, and then with total seriousness, to my chest, which meant fear more than injury. They asked if anyone else was under there. She shook her head. Then finally, because it was the question burning everything else brighter, Marlin asked, "Who are you hiding from?" Maddie closed her eyes and started crying without sound. Tino and Marlin exchanged one fast look over the mud. No more questions, not until Law got there. The first sheriff's unit rolled onto the midway service lane in under 6 minutes with lights throwing blue over sleeping carnival rides and wet ticket booths. Then came Fairground EMS in the utility cart, then a county deputy already holding a folder that made Marlin suspect there had been an overnight missing child call somewhere nearby, and the universe had simply not yet finished connecting the parts. Deputy Elise Harrow took one look under the wheel, one look at the child's shoe in Marlin's hand, and her face changed in the way official faces did when they stop managing public tone and start dealing with the real thing. "Everybody back," she said, but not too far, because Maddie, it turned out, would not move unless she could still see Marlin at the edge of the platform and Tino's yellow cable coil lying in the mud like some absurd anchor to a normal world. The outline came together fast and horribly. Maddie had been at the fair the night before with her older cousin. The cousin lost track of her during the concert crowd near the grandstand. At some point, a man she thought worked at the fair, because he wore a neon safety vest and had a radio clipped to his belt, had approached and told her he would help her find her family. Instead, he led her behind the rides. Something about his voice, his hand, or simple animal terror made her pull away and run. She crawled under the Ferris wheel because it was dark and crowded with equipment, and she thought no grown-up could easily reach her there. The man looked for her. She heard him walking in the mud and stepping around the ride supports. Then he left. She stayed there all night because the fair shut down around her. Then the generators quieted, and she no longer knew which way home was or which adult was safe. No one found her. No one except the bobcat. That detail lodged in every mind there, even as no one had room to talk about it properly. The animal still had not left. It sat 10 yards away at the edge of the midway lane now, watching the underside of the wheel as if all of dawn existed only for that one dark space and the child hidden inside it. Marlin would later remember that more clearly than the sheriff's questions or the first ambulance radio chatter. A wildcat sitting in plain view among sleeping carnival rides, waiting until the right, slow, stupid species finally noticed where to kneel. Maddie came out only when Deputy Harrow and the medic agreed to let Marlin lie fully in the mud and reach one arm into the shadow without grabbing her. "You come to me," he said. "That's all. You come to me and nobody else is touching you yet." After a long, shaking moment, she did. She crawled awkwardly forward, catching once on the low beam, then again on the tarp edge. And then she was out, all muddy knees and trembling shoulders and one missing shoe, and the kind of exhausted silence that made every adult around her want to look away because they couldn't stand what it said. The medic wrapped her in a thermal blanket. Deputy Harrow knelt so her badge and gun stayed low and harmless. The fairground supervisor, who arrived just in time to discover that his morning had become a crime scene, went pale and stayed that way. Then dispatch on Harrow's shoulder mic confirmed it. Missing child report. Filed the previous night at 10:14 p.m. Name matched. Family had been searching with deputies and fair staff for hours. Marlin sat back in the mud and let out a breath he had apparently been holding since the bobcat first looked under the wheel. When Maddie's aunt came tearing across the midway a few minutes later under escort, half crying and half running and wholly beyond dignity, something in the whole fairground seemed to shatter open. Carnival workers who had stood uselessly off to the side lowered their eyes. Tino pulled off his cap and rubbed both hands over his face. One of the deputies looked away hard enough to pretend he was checking the tilt-a-whirl gate chain, and still the bobcat remained. Only when Maddie was loaded into the ambulance beside her aunt and the scene had definitively passed from rescue into investigation did it finally stand. It looked once toward the open side of the platform, once toward the departing ambulance. Then, impossibly neat and silent in that churned, muddy place, it trotted behind the ring-toss trailer, passed beneath the sagging pennant strings, and vanished between the livestock tent and the perimeter fence into the mist rising off the low fairground field. Just gone. The day, unfortunately, kept going. By 7:30, the midway looked almost normal again to anyone arriving late enough not to know better. The Ferris wheel remained closed under sheriff's tape. Investigators photographed boot prints, the shoe, the mud drag, and the underside of the platform. The safety vest mentioned by Maddie triggered a search of employee inventories and contracted vendors. By noon, deputies had a person of interest tied to a temporary sanitation crew subcontractor who had no business being alone behind the rides with a child. By then, the story had already outrun the reports. The bobcat under the Ferris wheel, the shoe in the mud, the little girl beneath the platform, the operator who looked because the cat wouldn't leave. News stations mangled it by lunch. Social media polished it into miracle language by dinner. Carnival workers, to their credit, kept it closer to the truth. The bobcat stayed by the Ferris wheel. Then he saw the shoe in the mud. That was enough. 3 mornings later, after the sheriff reopened the ride area and the fair tried very hard to pretend it was still the same wholesome county spectacle it had been before sunrise that day, Marlin came back out before opening with his coffee and toolbox. The mud had dried at the top and remained soft underneath. The lights were off. The Ferris wheel rose empty against a pale sky. He stopped automatically at the same rear support. No shoe now. No deputies. No tape. Only at the edge of the service lane where the prize trailers cast a narrow shadow, a bobcat stood watching the wheel. Maybe the same one. Maybe not. It held still for a second, then turned and disappeared between the carnival trucks as if the fairground had only ever been one more temporary landscape for something wilder to pass through.